Hi there. I started a thread several years ago in the forum about early Liverpool Jiu-Jitsu and Judo, and it became quite a popular thread. And one of the main contributors, Simon Keegan, actually then wrote a book on this topic, which I've reviewed. Very, very detailed book. So in researching topics for the thread, I was aware of the archive of judo historical related material at Bath, which had been amassed by Richard Bowen, who is a long-time celebrated international judo competitor. But I was alerted to another aspect by Gary Harper when I was chatting to him regarding the lost hip kiss manual. And the subject of the archive came up, and Gary said or mentioned that Dickie Bowen had written a book, a history, 100 years of judo in Great Britain, totally unaware of it. And although the paperback is largely unavailable, the book is available in 2 parts on Kindle, and I immediately bought it and was engrossed and found a delightful read. The history can be broken into 3 main phases: the origin in Japan, then the introduction of initially Jiu-Jitsu into Great Britain, and the period leading up to the war, then World War II and subsequent. So they're quite easy chunks to talk about. So there's quite a bit about the history of Japan in the book, and it's very well presented. It's very, very interesting reading because it's a very turbulent history with clan wars and rivalry and so on. And from this, Jiu-Jitsu emerged. Then when we came to the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration 1868, then the need for the samurai skills lessened because it wasn't continual warfare, and it was supposedly a period of peace. However, there were clashes with disaffected former samurai who were known as ronin, and they formed bands and quite often terrorized various localities. So it was a very turbulent time. And one of the things that the Japanese police was very eager to get was a decent method of unarmed control tactics. And this led to the very famous 1888 competition, which pitted various schools of jiu-jitsu or various proponents of jiu-jitsu schools against the Kodokan. And the Kodokan emerged the winner and was accepted by the police and also became the dominant version of jiu-jitsu, the modern version of jiu-jitsu. And this was down to the work of Jigoro Kano, who had studied jiu-jitsu for a few years, not a tremendously long time. He's quite a young man, and took what he considered the best and created judo, which had an ethical base and was more palatable in that era. Now, that's just a thumbnail sketch. Richard Bowen goes into tremendous detail about all the different jiu-jitsu schools, Professor Kano's studies, and the various rivalries and so on at the time. Now, one of the targets for the Ronins' rage were foreigners. They despised the foreign influence. Japan was deeply attracted to the Western nations because they'd been isolated for so long, and the United States and Great Britain and the European nations were all looking to trade with Japan, and also the Japanese embraced Western culture to a large extent, and the traditionalists amongst the Ronin violently objected to this. And in the book there's an incident which I think I'll retell. I won't do it word for word, but I'll cut it down a little bit, but it's a very, very significant episode. This was in March of 1868. The British minister, who would be in effect the ambassador, Sir Henry Parkes, set off from the old temple to house the legation for an audience with Emperor Matsuhito. The order of the procession was 17 mounted lancers of the London Metropolitan Police. Now just pause there. The Met had mounted lancers. They could use them now with all those demonstrations every Saturday in London. Wouldn't it be great if they had mounted lancers? Anyway, various dignitaries in the VIP party, a guard of the 9th of Foot Regiment, and 1,500 or more Japanese soldiers, and a couple of or a few British naval officers, two of whom were surgeons. The head of the procession had turned a corner when two Ronin with naked swords and in the maddest fury began hacking and slashing. As the street was so narrow and the overhanging eave so wide, the police could not use the lancers. Nakai jumped off his horse and, drawing his sword, engaged one, but tripped, receiving a severe cut on his head, the main force of which he had managed to deflect. Meanwhile, Goto, with sword in hand, rushed to the defence of his companion. These were part of the VIP entourage. The two, fighting like fury, killed the ruffian. Nakai, jumping up, beheaded him. The other Ronin rushed at Sir Henry, cutting and slashing as he went, but fortunately missed. Satao had a narrow escape, with his horse being cut close to his rider's knee. Part of the horse's nostril was cut off. By now the Ronin was in the middle of the 9th, still cutting and slashing. Mitford continues, I jumped out of my palanquin and rushed forward. There were pools of blood in the street, and I saw the murderer coming at me, by this time himself wounded but not seriously, and full of fight. His sword was dripping and his face bleeding. I knew enough of Japanese swordsmanship to be aware that it was no use trying to avoid his blow, so I rushed in under his guard and wrenched the bleeding sword out of his grip. I handed him over to the men of the 9th, but he managed to wriggle away from and bolted down a passage into a courtyard. Mitford then ran up to see if his minister was safe. He was, and quite unmoved. As I came up with him, I stumbled over something. It was a man's head. The street was a shambles. 9 of the escort and 1 man of the 9th and 4 horses had been wounded. Sir Henry's groom was also bleeding. 3 days later, the minister once more set off for an audience with the emperor. Only 2 men of the Met lancers were fit to escort. This time there were crowds of samurai, a vision from the 11th century, to guard the procession, and the audience was concluded successfully. Later, Queen Victoria was to present swords of honour to Goto and Nakai for their part in protecting her minister. So two Ronin, who were obviously highly skilled samurai, caused havoc. And it was only the prominence of that minister that caused this to be noted. This kind of thing was a frequent occurrence, such attacks. And it was, as I say, a very, very turbulent time. We also meet the early foreign students of the martial arts. In particular, E.J. Harrison, who lived there for many years, and he was the first non-Japanese to be granted a Kodokan black belt. He spoke several languages, and he's now remembered for his books, in particular Fighting Spirit of Japan, which I'll put a link to. Tremendous book. Now, when I started reading his books, the photo on the cover usually showed an elderly gentleman, but pictures of him from this era show a superb athlete. He had a very, very well-developed body, six-pack and so on, and he's tremendously athletic. And he had a very much a spirit of an explorer. He lived in many countries and had a fascinating life. And it's great that the book remembers him. Okay, so as I say, that's just a thumbnail sketch. So next we look at Jiu-Jitsu arriving in England. The prime figure was Edward Barton Wright, who spent 4 years in Japan training in Jiu-Jitsu. And he did spend some time at the Kodokan, so he was aware of Judo. He came back to London and started a couple of businesses, but he started promoting Jiu-Jitsu. And he opened a school in Shaftesbury Avenue. And he wrote several articles and also put on demonstrations, including defeating a champion wrestler. And so he gained quite a bit of celebrity. He marketed Jiu-Jitsu in an early example of branding as Bartitsu, play on his name and a play on Jiu-Jitsu. And it was mentioned, slightly misspelled, by Arthur Conan Doyle as being the martial arts studied by Sherlock Holmes, which in fact saved his life at Reichenbach Falls. So it was a well-known, and people were fascinated. At this time, people were starting to be really fascinated by Japan, the art and pottery and everything. And just as the Japanese were importing British culture or Western culture, we were fascinated by Japanese culture. And Jiu-Jitsu or Bartitsu was very, very much part of this. In 1900, Yukio Tani arrived to work for Barton Wright, and he was initially affiliated to one of the main jiu-jitsu schools. That's where he got his skill. He wasn't a Kodokan exponent, but later on in Liverpool he met a Japanese Kodokan expert excuse me, and started learning judo, and this was at a place called Hengler's Circus, which is and the Olympia, which is basically one of the entertainment complexes, which is actually still in operation in West Derby Road. Tani was without doubt one of the major movers in the popularity of jiu-jitsu and judo. He started putting on challenges on music halls where he would accept challenges from all comers, and he was quite a diminutive character. He wasn't big, and as far as anybody can find out, he was never defeated. Now, that is a big ask, but Richard Bowen and also Graham Noble have delved into the record, the contemporary accounts, and there's no verified accounts of anybody who has been able to claim to have defeated him, albeit they were working under jiu-jitsu rules with a gi top on. So he continued to be a major figure well into the post-war era, really, and was an instructor regularly at the Budokai, which we'll come to a little bit later. Because in 1906, Gunji Koizumi arrived in Liverpool. He was engaged as an instructor at the Kara Ashikaga School in Maryland Street, a place that I know well because many years ago I started doing Filipino martial arts in Maryland Street, and I knew its history, and every time I went there, I used to train mainly on a Sunday, I would think about it. Kara Ashikaga School, which didn't actually exist. It was a mail order setup. There was no Kara Ashikaga any more than there was Kendo Nagasaki in professional wrestling. But after a fairly short period, Koizumi realised this, and he moved down to London, and he eventually founded the Budokai, which is still an illustrious club, the prime judo club in the country, and many noted competitors and noted instructors started there. The book mentions a couple of figures who may be familiar to regular viewers of this channel who became prominent. James Hipkiss, whose Lost Manual we reviewed, he's mentioned and his background is discussed. Also Jerry Skyner. Jerry Skyner taught in Liverpool in Mount Pleasant, and he was affiliated with a South African organisation run by Jack Robinson. Now Jack Robinson was a controversial figure, and he was the father of Joe and Doug Robinson, and another, I don't know if he was a brother or a cousin, with Norman Robinson, who was later a big figure in South African karate. But Joe and Doug were very well known for some of the fight scenes in the Bond films and the Avengers, for example. And they were big guys, big units, and they were very good at judo. They came from that tradition. But Skyner had trained with Kawaishi, who spent time in Liverpool. Now Kawaishi was again primarily jiu-jitsu background, and he was a formidable exponent. But as the book points out, he was somewhat controversial. He wasn't he wasn't on the straight and narrow all the time, you might say. But he left a legacy, including one of the classic books on self-defense. Really good material. So now we come to World War II, and a chap called Trevor Leggett had been training in Japan for several years very, very seriously, and he was employed at the British Embassy. And after Pearl Harbor, the diplomats were interned, and eventually there was an exchange of diplomats from the Japanese diplomats from the UK were returned, and our diplomats were allowed home. And Trevor Leggett, became a very, very senior figure on the scene. He eventually rose to be a sixth Dan and wrote a couple of books. And he was a big guy, and by all accounts, a very, very good and very patient instructor. Very, very keen on importing the ethical base of judo. He was very religious. He was a Buddhist, and that was his legacy. George Chu, a Budokai black belt, was called up into the RAF and started a club in RAF Blackpool called the Kubukai, which eventually trained over 5,000 personnel. That's amazing. Obviously, the great work done by W.E. Fairbairn and E.A. Sykes is mentioned. Their work with the Commando Forces and the Special Operations Executive. Fairbairn obviously was an early black belt. He got to second Dan and so on. Very solid base in both judo and in Kung Fu, but put it through his own filter and produced his own version of Combatives. Also, Stan Bissell, who was a wrestling champion and also a Budokai black belt, who trained the Met Police and then was sent up to Aknakari to train the commandos, and he left his mark on them. The training was very highly regarded. Then, still during the war, we have the surprising history of judo in the prisoner of war camps. Now, generally, it wasn't allowed. Any kind of martial training wasn't allowed, but there was one camp in particular where the commandant was rather avuncular and had a laissez-faire aspect, and he let the guys do all sorts of activities, and judo became very, very popular, mainly under Percy Sakina, who managed to use mattresses as mats, and a lot of guys were introduced to judo who later then became stalwarts, in particular Eric Dominy. He started his judo in the camp and later wrote several books, including, there was a series back then called Teach Yourself, which could be anything, chess, snooker, whatever, yoga, I remember. They were yellow covered books, and he wrote the Teach Yourself Judo, as well as several other books, and that's how I first heard of him. So in the post-war era, again, the major figure is Koizumi, known fondly as GK, who through the Budokai and an annual demonstration / competition at the Royal Albert Hall, which was very prominent and did include other martial arts, usually kendo, later on karate, aikido, things like that. Big annual event everyone looked forward to, and he was instrumental in founding the British Judo Association and then the European Judo Union. And the book goes into tremendous detail on this. He's got the minutes of the meetings, and GK wanted it to be done by the traditional British way, where you have a committee, secretary, treasurer, committee have votes and everything, and it's all very democratic and fair and everything. It's not a dictatorship, which would tend to be the model in Japan, where the guy with the highest grade would just dictate what happened. And this led to international competitions, European, world competitions, which eventually led to the 64 Olympics, where judo was introduced for the first time. It wasn't taken up again for a few games, and now is a regular central sport internationally in the Olympics and regular world championships as well. There were other rival organisations, the BJC, British Judo Council, and the AJA, Amateur Judo Association. They're not mentioned, or if they are, it's only in passing, and there's no kind of dissection about why they started and what the rivalry was and the directions and so on. And there were good guys in those organisations. In particular, the AJA had Pat Butler, who wrote a couple of really good books, including a terrific book on self-defense, which I've reviewed. For at the time, it was a really good book. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more about that, but I'm sure that Dickie Bowen had a lot he had to leave out. Then we come to extracts from GK's diary, which detail his planned suicide, and it's very sad reading. And he took his own life in 1965. He single-handedly kept the Budokai going, quite often paying the cost out of his own pocket in times of financial struggles. He was a superb instructor, an inspirational leader, and a true gentleman. The book really ends with his death, which was the end of an era, and on a much obviously less important scale, it was exactly at that time, April of 65, that I was still doing judo, and exactly around that time the first karate exhibition was held at St. George's Hall, and Frank Vernon came down to the dojo. I was doing judo, and he put a poster up, and I asked him about where they trained, etc., and went down to the George's Hall, watched the demonstration. That was a Friday. The Sunday I went to the Red Triangle to sign up, and that was exactly the time that GK ended his life. So very much a time of change for me, and an end of an era when really judo was mainly practiced in church halls and scout huts. The guys had to put the mats down. Quite often they were made of any old material, bits of foam rubber that they put together, canvas over the top, lumps in them and so on. No showers or anything like that. That was the main body of judo. In Liverpool there was a lot of judo. Big organisations such as English Electric, Pilkingtons had their own judo clubs. It was very, very well taken up. But the shift then became into much better facilities, money from the Sports Council and so on for the teams and so on, into the modern era. And the book doesn't cover that, but it's available in such books as The Pajama Game, which I've reviewed. Terrific way to continue the story. Again, I've only skimmed the exhaustive narrative. Richard Bowen died in 2005 himself, but the two books, or the two Kindle parts of the book, remain as an indelible legacy, and I whiled away many a fascinated hour reading them. And anybody interested in the history of the martial arts, particularly in the UK, will regard these books as invaluable treasures.